Hey everybody, welcome to a special edition of Hot Takes with Billy Business. Now, usually I have a guest on my show to talk with me about one of my unpopular movie opinions. Today we're going to do things a little bit differently. I had mentioned at some point, I think on Screen Junkies, that there was a period of time where I had written an essay about Batman Returns. And when people demanded, quite literally demanded that I put this out online because they needed to see what I had to say, um, I had to backtrack a little bit because it was an essay in terms of what it was going for, but in actual structure, it was a little sloppy Joe. A lot of just kind of bullet points here and there, sentences unfinished. So I had said, maybe I would put it out someday. But then I decided, what if I took, the skeleton of that essay, some of the talking points, some of the ideas, and actually turn it into an episode where I could be a little bit more conversational, a little bit more free flowing with my thoughts. And overall, just kind of, I think maybe speaking it is a better medium than trying to write it all down. So this is the Batman Returns essay, more or less. I'm kind of using a lot of the bullet points, a lot of the meat that was in there, a lot of the ideas, and I just want to talk about Batman Returns because I feel like this is a movie where, a lot of history remembers the 1989 Batman, or especially, Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. But Batman Returns kind of gets lost in the shuffle a lot of times, and definitely one of my favorites. So I wanted to do a special episode. We will return next week with a normal episode. I'll be talking with the Professor Lon Harris about Pacific Rim. But this week, you get to hear just my solo thoughts on Batman Returns. Welcome, everybody, to a special edition of Hot Takes with Billy Business. Today, I'm talking about Batman Returns. Batman Returns is, to me, a surreal nightmare of human pain and suffering. And I know that sounds a little crazy, but I do think that Batman Returns is on its head. I think it's a little bit more of a character study than it is an actual narrative. And I'm going to get into that. Basically, how I feel that the three main characters of Batman Returns are kind of their projections of different types of human pain and suffering. For Penguin, we're talking about the pain of rejection. For Catwoman, it's physical abuse. And for Batman, it's addiction. And how this movie is more than just another Batman story. I feel like it's a portrait of three people in pain trying to deal with their pain. And if you take it as that, I think it's a lot more. But let's rewind the clocks a little bit. Let's go back and give a little bit of context. So the summer of 1989 gave birth to the phenomenon known as Batmania. Of course, talking about Tim Burton's big screen adaptation of Batman, hitting theaters with Michael Keaton as the Caped Crusader against Joker in one of Jack Nicholson's most iconic roles, I would have to say. And, the world was more than ready for it. The world was ready for a new interpretation of Batman, a darker interpretation of Batman. I mean, you couldn't turn around without seeing the Bat insignia, that logo, somewhere within 10 square feet of you. I mean, to put it into context, 1989, I was only 3 years old at the time, and some of my first memories of childhood are going to the grocery store and seeing the I don't know if you guys remember this. There was Batman cereal and tortilla chips. I definitely remember eating the Batman tortilla chips. They were basically regular tortilla chips, but in the Bat insignia. So this thing was everywhere. It was a huge box office hit, and just tons of merchandise, including the kick-ass soundtrack by Prince. All the merchandise is flying off the shelves in a Bat frenzy. So it really was no surprise to anyone that The Dark Knight would return to Gotham for another big screen outing in 1992's Batman Returns. However, I believe that what we got wasn't so much a sequel to a blockbuster as it was a surrealistic, nightmarish tale of pain and suffering. And in my opinion, I think it's a masterpiece. Now, before I get too far into this, I just want to be clear. Structurally speaking, this movie has some serious faults, and honestly, it's kind of it's a hodgepodge. It's a little scattered. So the plot basically is abandoned by his parents at birth. The hideously deformed Penguin, played by Danny DeVito, emerges from the sewers of Gotham to punish the world that abandoned him, first by trying to become mayor, and later by literally trying to destroy the entire city with the, of course, now infamous exploding missile penguins. Along the way, he teams up with Catwoman, Michelle Pfeiffer, who's transformed from the meek, mistreated Selena Kyle into the aggressive anti-hero who seeks revenge upon Max Schreck, played by Christopher Walken, the man who's helping Penguin take over Gotham. It's up to Batman, again played by Michael Keaton, to stop the shenanigans and get Gotham City back in order. Now, that was a mouthful, right? I'm literally looking at the summary that I wrote up right there, and there's a lot happening. Taken as a traditional narrative, it's a little bit messy. It's a little bit all over the place. I definitely think that there are things in this movie, some character choices, some moments, some motivations that maybe in the sense of telling one unified narrative don't quite make sense. There are easier way to do certain things. But what if this movie is really just a portrait of these three people consumed by different aspects of emotional pain? So what if this is more just a character study of these three people than it is trying to tell you a conventional Batman story, or hell, even a conventional narrative movie? I think when you think of Batman Returns as a character study rather than a blockbuster, that's where I think this movie really shines. So I want to start with the Penguin, who to me is the personification, the characterization of this idea of rejection. So let's get something straight right off the bat with Penguin. This is a version of the Penguin that bears almost no resemblance to his comic book counterpart. Almost none. I mean, when I first started reading comics, I was actually surprised to learn that the Penguin was not a hideously deformed Penguin man. I picked up after this movie. I think because I would have been about 5 or 6 when Batman Returns came out, so I would have been perusing the comic book at the time. You could get comic books at the grocery store. So I would have been perusing, and I remembered I picked up a handful of issues and realized the Penguin, he's not like a deformed freak of nature who was given the boot by his parents at birth. He's just, a stocky, fat little gangster who's relatively charming. I mean, he owns a nightclub, for crying out loud, at least in the later iterations of the comic, and I think in the animated series too. Which is strange all on its own, because the animated series is like an amalgamation of a couple different versions of Penguin, a little bit of Burton, a lot of bit of comics. But anyways, and it's just this little short, fat gangster with a pointy nose. That was kind of it. And looking at it on its head, I feel like I'm the type of person that usually is championing, like, you need to follow the source material or draw inspiration from the source material if you're not going to follow it, which is fine. But I think Tim Burton's version of the Penguin is a very welcome reimagining of this character. The very beginning of the film gives us this very operatic origin for Oswald Cobblepot, who's the Penguin, and he's supposed to be our main villain of this movie. But it's funny because more than any other Batman villain in, in his entire rogues gallery. I feel like this version of Penguin, this version of Oswald is actually has more in common with Bruce Wayne and Batman than any other villain. While young Bruce's parents were kind of removed from the picture at an early age, Penguin is the polar opposite. His parents willingly and forcefully removed him from the picture at an early age. So just like Batman, and also just like Batman, he finds solace and purpose in this company of animals. For Bruce, it was at a cave full of bats, and Oswald kind of finds his identity in a sewer full of penguins. Which, by the way, this is exactly what I'm talking about, where I'm saying, like, there are things narratively in this movie that don't add up, but thematically work well. Like, why are there sewers full of penguins? Like, penguins do not live in sewers. Okay, sure. You could really bend over backwards and say, like, okay, well, that zoo that he was in, or that he, made his cave or his lair used to be a fully functioning zoo, and then they shut it down, and then the penguins escaped and bred in the sewer. I don't know. Look, a lot of hoops you got to jump through, but if you take it at face value, for kind of the metaphor that it is, I think that's really great. I really love that connection between Bruce and Oswald, and there's a great line by Max Schreck where he's like, if they had an 86, if your parents had an 86 to you back in the day, you two could have been roomies in prep school. I like that idea that this is the other side of this kind of royal Gotham family, the Cobblepots and the Waynes, and that the Waynes were taken from Bruce, and that Oswald was given away from that lifestyle. I think that's such a great contrast, and it really cements who Penguin is going to be in this movie. He is bred from this rejection not only from society but his own family, and that makes him live this life that's just full of anger and confusion. And what I think is so interesting about this version of the Penguin is, and I go back and forth on this a lot, there are times where Penguin is, telling Max Schreck, I want to come to the surface. I want to find out who my parents are. I want to be a part of, everything that's up there. Oh, like Little Mermaid. I want to be where the people are. Oswald was saying the same thing. And I go back and forth because, you kind of find out throughout the course of the movie, like, this is information that he had already figured out. He already knew who his parents were, and he already wanted revenge. But there's such conviction in his voice, especially when he's telling Max, who he has no reason to lie to at this point. When he tells him, that he just wants to be a part of society and he just wants to know where he comes from. And I think that there is real hurt behind his anger. And I think a lot of times when we think of, comic book villains or Batman villains, their objective comes from either a position of power or a position of chaos, or wanting to do something that benefits them in a way that it's either monetary or whatever the case may be. But Penguin's whole MO this entire time is revenge from a place of hurt. And I think that's kind of interesting, and that sets him apart from, some of the other villains that came before and come after. Is, a lot of times we see people who do terrible things or who are just mean, miserable people. And we find out later on that they're coming from a place of pain. And I think Oswald is coming from a place of pain in everything that he does. Now, that's not to excuse anything that he does or make any sort of justification for the way he treats people, because as we get into this, you're going to find out he's really not a good dude. But more than any other Batman villain, more than any other villain, more than anyone in almost any narrative, I really feel for Penguin, and I feel for where he's coming from. And though I don't agree and I don't condone the things he does, even after he's done terrible things, when he's taken to his death at the end and the penguins surround him and bring him into the water, you feel this sense of tragedy. And there's not a lot of tragedy with a lot of comic book villains. Here and there, sure, but this is done so well that you feel, you understand why he is the way he is. And what's interesting too about the Penguin is, this movie came out in 1992. This is well before the huge boom of the internet age. It's kind of amazing how the psychology of the Penguin kind of eerily predicted what would then, what would later become the prototypical internet troll. I truly think if you think of Penguin in terms of like an internet troll, it kind of starts to fall into place a little bit. It makes a lot more sense. I mean, even his plan is kind of like it's a precursor. Like his plan, he just wants to cast out the firstborn son of the Cobblepots, or he wants to cast out the firstborn sons of Gotham since he was, the firstborn Cobblepot, and he wants to kidnap and kill every firstborn son. He spends a lot of his time gathering names and addresses of the people that he wants to torment. That kind of sounds like a precursor to doxing, does it not? Uh, it's also kind of analogous to the way, he hides behind, like Max Schreck and this kind of identity. It's almost like the mayor is his Twitter handle, and it's his online avatar. That's what, people see. But then he's going and he's going upstairs to that apartment at that desk, and he's on his burner account, and he's, that's where he's really becoming this evil person. And I think it's also analogous to the way that he treats women. More specifically, how he treats women that reject him. I mean, there's that great scene with Catwoman where, she and him, they pull off their plan with the Ice Princess. Catwoman's not entirely happy with how things went. He's over the moon. He wants to, marry her, make her a little trophy wife for himself, and she says no. And his reaction to her rejecting his advances is to kill her, is to literally, put his umbrella around her neck and fly her off. And, that it's such an interesting parallel to where we are today. When you think of kind of like the internet troll, I immediately think of the Penguin because a lot of his characteristics are the same. And again, I truly believe this about all internet trolls. And I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist or whatever, so I have no bearings on this. But I have to believe that every internet troll, to some degree, coming from somewhere, is this place of pain and trying to get back your power however you feel you can. And I feel like that's what Oswald is doing in this whole movie, is trying to get back some sort of power because he's always had none. And he's like a horny teenager. Everything that he says is sounds like something you would hear online, but I think it all kind of stems from this notion of rejection. And in that sense, if you can look past it, sometimes you see those threads. I believe it was Sarah Silverman, who there was this troll who was just giving her such a hard time, and instead of fighting him back, she, asked him, what's your deal? Why are you so angry? And it turned into this kind of beautiful thread where he was like, I'm in a lot of pain and I act out and no one will help me and blah, blah, blah. And I kind of feel like that's where we are with Penguin. He was born different, cast aside, and just it's tragic that, this character chose that path, but that's what happens all too often with a character or with someone who kind of has that pain of rejection. So I definitely think that while it's not accurate to the source material, I don't know how you can have something that is so rich like the Penguin, something so rich with those pathos, and say that it's like an invalid version of that character. I think that's everything should have, in my opinion, every version of the Penguin should have been retconned to what Tim Burton did with that character. But that didn't happen. Let's move on now to Bruce, Batman. And his pain is a little interesting to me because he is suffering massively from addiction. And I think by this point in the series, and it was only the second movie, but this is already a vastly different Bruce, a vastly different Batman than we got in the first Tim Burton's 1989 Batman. This is a character who obviously a lot has happened to him in the year or two since the Joker, and while Bruce being addicted to Batman, it's not a stretch. I mean, that's kind of been one of the focal points of that character. But I think it's the lengths to which he'll go to feed that addiction, which is more interesting to me. Because at this point, you have to think of what his mission statement was to become Batman. His mission statement was to, make sure that whatever happened to his parents never happened again. But it's always goes back to his parents, to that trauma that brought him in. And I think it's in this movie, his addiction has become more than just avenging his parents. In fact, this is the only Batman movie in that original Burton Schumacher anthology. So this is Batman, Batman Returns, Batman Forever, and Batman and Robin. This is the only Batman movie in those first four where he doesn't acknowledge his childhood trauma in any way, shape, or form. This is a Batman who is, really into being Batman, I feel like, as a shield for having to face his real life as Bruce Wayne. And I think Bruce kind of loses his identity as the film goes on. And sometimes they play it humorously. Sometimes it's played metaphorically, but I think the reason why Bruce kind of loses himself is that he uses the Batman character to deny himself any sort of emotion or reason, or sometimes accountability, to be honest with you. I think he knows that Batman as a symbol, as a person he can become, is beyond any reason. And that's almost, expected of Batman. He's absolute judge, jury, and in the case of this movie, at least, he's executioner too. I think he uses Batman to not have to deal with the thoughts that he has when he's Bruce. Let me give you an example. Think back to the scene where Bruce first sees Oswald on TV. I think Alfred is decorating the Christmas tree, and this is, Penguin has just saved the mayor's son, and he's going on TV saying all he wants to do is find his parents, and Bruce sits there and he says to Alfred, I hope he finds them. It's this moment of sympathy. He feels for Oswald. He's sympathizing with the situation. And then, like a scene or two later, almost out of the blue, he drives past Oswald at the public records, the Court of Public Records, in the Batmobile and in his Batman suit. And he, Alfred's like, why can't you just believe that this guy is what he says he is? Why must, and I believe he says, why must you be the only one to suffer? And Batman just doesn't buy it. And this is a perfect example, too, of what I mean by narratively, this seems a little out of place. The scene seems strange. It almost seems like we missed a scene or two between Bruce on the couch saying that he hopes this guy finds his parents, and then 3 minutes later, he's, driving by saying, I don't trust this guy at all. It seems like we missed something, but I think this is exactly where the idea that Batman is a different person than Bruce, and Bruce uses Batman as an excuse to kind of flush out everything else. I think that's where this comes into play, because I do think Alfred makes a very good point. A point that comes back later, which is I I think the addiction to Batman, more than just wanting to deny oneself, thoughts and feelings, it's also this need for our pain. And I think we do this as humans a lot. It's for our pain to mean something, and a lot of times we get that meaning uh, of pain through exclusivity. Like if someone is suffering the same or more than us, like it somehow diminishes what we are going through. And I think this is perfectly supported by, one of my favorite moments of this entire movie is at the end, or towards the end, when it's like the third act, and Penguin jumps on Batman. He says, "You're just mad because I'm a genuine freak and you have to wear a mask." And a typical Batman response to that would be like, "Well, you're going to be afraid when I, kick your ass," or whatever it is. But Batman just shrugs and says, "You might be right." And I think it's like this. That's why I said that it's almost played sometimes humorously. I think there's this self realization at a certain point, especially in the third act, when the lines between Batman and Bruce are blurred, that he almost realizes that he could never trust Penguin, because as Batman, it's almost like he has to have the exclusivity of pain. And it's kind of been something that's people have been goading him about the entire movie. Think about Max Schreck, like, hey, this could have been, Oswald could have been like you. And I think that doesn't sit right with Bruce, because he needs his pain for his parents to be significant. And you get this feeling that he has to feel like he is in the most pain. Um, and it's also very interesting too, because ultimately Batman's instinct about the Penguin, while maybe coming from a selfish place, it's interesting because it ended up being correct. But Bruce's emotion towards Oswald is almost seen as a weakness, because for Batman to be efficient, as this movie, tells us, for Batman to be efficient, he almost has to assume the worst of everybody. Because if Bruce Wayne had been sucked in, like, oh, I hope he finds his parents, I know how he feels, I've been, in a similar situation, I want to do what I can for him, this would be a very different movie. And he could have helped Penguin become mayor. A lot of things could have happened. But because he has the responsibility of Batman, this addiction to be Batman and divorce himself from all feelings and emotions, it's almost a prerequisite to be the job, that Batman has to assume that everybody is at their worst at all times. And that has to weigh on his conscience. That has to weigh on just his everyday psyche. If you go around expecting expecting that everyone's going to be their worst selves, like, of course he's going to become a little paranoid, and he's not going to, it's depressing. It's going to be depressing. So I could see why the shield of Batman, the shield of just get the job done and focus on the goal, is appealing to him. To the point where he kind of even forgets who he is at certain times. Again, played humorously in that scene where he meets Selina at Shrek's department store, and he forgets that he's already met her as Batman, and he does that great, "Oh, I mistook me for someone else." That duality is so great, and it's played so differently in this movie. A lot of Batman movies, especially like Batman Forever, The Dark Knight, they play with that idea of duality. Can he be both Bruce and Batman? And I feel like this is such a different interpretation of that age-old question of the dual with duality. And I think we all as people have duality as part of our it's human nature. You are someone different with your family than you are with your friends. You are at work. You fragment yourself. And I think for Bruce, it's this addiction to one fragment of himself, which is Batman, that is kind of taken over. You still with me? All right. Let's move on to Catwoman. Selena Kyle. This is a tough one, because when you really think about it, I'm not sure if she has quite the bow on her character arc. Well, let's walk through it. Catwoman is definitely the personification of abuse, both emotional and physical abuse. She is born, I mean, Catwoman is literally born out of physical abuse, being pushed out the window by Max Schreck. This character is interesting because Selena is abused by all three of the men in her life, meaning her boss, Max Schreck, her, I don't know, what would you call it? Friend, acquaintance, the Penguin, and then her would be lover, Batman. Um, it's very interesting to me too that that Catwoman kind of seeks revenge on each of them to the point where she almost kind of loses track. It's kind of, if you watch the movie again, let me say it again. Narratively, it's a little haphazard because her main focus is to get at Max. So she blows up his store. It's when she encounters Batman. Then her revenge shifts. She wants to frame Batman. But then her revenge shifts yet again to the Penguin. But she never really gets back at the Penguin. Instead, she shifts back to Max again. And I think that's part of her narrative, is trying to take back her power. Um, there's also something kind of sad but interesting about the first time that she goes out as Catwoman. They always say that a lot of abusers are people who themselves have been abused. And I think that's exactly what happens. She saves that woman in a very violent fashion. Uh, but then she turns around and kind of scolds her. She gets angry with her. She bullies that woman for being in the position to be where she was. Um, and I think that's kind of part of why the ending, it's unhappy in the sense that she can't be with Bruce, but it's logical because she's a victim of his abuse. So by the end, Batman has torn off his mask because he knows he can't emotionally connect with her as Batman, and she realizes that the man that she could be with is also the man that gave her the burn and abused her, and it would never be the fairy tale story that Bruce would want it to be. And deep down, I think Bruce probably knew it too. Um, but she also has kind of this duel with duality. And you think back to when she's Selena Kyle at the beginning of the movie, and she was always kind of fearless in a sense. I never got that she was nervous, just kind of nerdy. But the one thing that I do think is interesting is, she was always kind of a little bit more rational, I guess. You know, Catwoman, when she turns into Catwoman, she becomes this creature of impulse. And when she's Selena Kyle at the beginning, it's a little bit more controlled. Well, it's a lot more controlled. But one of my favorite moments of the entire film is when she's looking at that window display and she's saying, "Why are you doing this?" to herself. It's like all these characters are aware of the pain that they are in and the actions that they are doing according to the emotional state that they're in, but none of them can control themselves. It's a portrait of three people in different kinds of pain, out of control. And when you think of it like that, that ending with Penguin dying, and Catwoman, quasi dying, and Bruce just driving home by himself to feed his addiction, to become Batman again once that signal lights up. There's no other way for that movie to end. That movie is exactly perfect in that sense of like, this is the three people, they're in pain. This is, this is a portrait of them, and they're gonna go on. Bruce is gonna go on living in pain, at least in this world. I know that Joel Schumacher came in with a different vision and tried to clean that up a little bit, but if you take this movie at face value, that's just kind of what they are and who they are. Now let's talk about the wild card here, Max Schreck, because I really tried to think of what Max Schreck represents. And I think Max Schreck represents the what he represents why the script narratively sometimes does not congeal together. I think that Max Schreck is a character that gets all the other characters to points where they need to be without necessarily himself kind of having any sort of arc. It's very strange because Max's whole motivation is to get that power plant going. Because he says, I want to have a legacy. I want something, to pass down to my son. But he's owner of Shrek's department store. Like, he has a legacy already. People know him as, the Santa Claus of Gotham, and he's like beloved by Gotham, and he has the store to live on. So I'm very confused as to why he would, why this power plant is so important, but it's the driver of everyone else in the story. His physical abuse of Catwoman turns her into Catwoman. His wanting to scheme to get his power plant passed goes, pushes Oswald to become the mayor, only to be rejected again by the people of Gotham, who claimed that they loved him, but, they only love you when you're doing something for him. And he, for Bruce, all he really does is get Bruce in the same room with Selina Kyle so they can go off and have their own kind of storyline. I'm not really sure what Max Schreck is to this story, and I do feel, if I can kind of, do some fantasy booking here, I do feel like this should have stayed as kind of what the original idea was, to have it be Harvey Dent. So what I would have done is I would have had Harvey, he would have, in between the last movie and this one, he would have kind of stepped down as DA, and he wanted to, either get into business or something, and it wasn't quite working out. But he knew that if he could, maybe he became a senator. Whatever the case would be, if Harvey Dent knew that this power plant was going to be his legacy, maybe there was a case that he blew, and he didn't want his last legacy to be a blown case or something of that nature. If you substitute him out and you put Harvey Dent in, I think it all makes a little bit more sense. Bruce now has ties to Harvey Dent, so there's a little bit more of a personal connection there. Also, I feel like, if we're talking about duality, we're talking about Batman and Bruce trying to coexist with each other. We're talking about Selina Kyle and Catwoman, and that line, crossing that line between revenge and being, a hero or an anti-hero or a villain. When you're talking about all that duality, you could have Harvey there, who is literally the personification of duality, and you could have him, kind of regretfully doing things. You could have him have, Selina finds out about what Harvey's going to do, something that he's felt guilty about, with that power plant, and maybe he really doesn't want to do it, but he has to push her out the window because he has to do what he has to do to get that done, because his legacy is so important to him. Maybe he flips that coin. He's like, I don't want to do this, but I have to push her out that window. That it also makes more sense how he could have a campaign for mayor and kind of be so well connected politically if it's Harvey Dent. who's pushing behind Oswald Cobblepot as kind of a dummy mayor. Uh, and again, he could the more kind of humanistic version of Harvey that we saw in that first '89 Batman movie. That could have that could be something where he actually legitimately does want to help Oswald. So I do feel like, this is a long way of just saying I think that Max Schreck is kind of a character that ties all the other three together. But I really love this movie, guys. I've been talking for almost 40 minutes, potentially just babbling on about nothing. Hopefully, you guys were able to kind of follow my train of thought. I do think that this is Tim Burton's masterpiece. I think this is one of the most beautiful looking movies. It's one of the most beautiful sounding movies. It's one of the most beautiful movies about human beings, which is so funny to me that when I talk about what's the most human movie, it's about, two people who dress up in costumes and one who's like a deformed penguin man. Like, the way that Tim Burton is able to portray the humanity in flawed, quote unquote, freaks, uh, this is the movie that I think best represents that. I know he had done it before in Edward Scissorhands, and it's kind of just like a staple of who Tim Burton is. It's finding that beauty in the freak show of things. But I think this was the first and, for me, last time that he really nailed the pathos. He really nailed the emotion. He really was kind of fearless. I mean, to have a Batman movie where Batman is kind of not at the center of it, to not just do the same thing that made the first one successful, and this one wasn't as successful. I think this movie is not. It's I don't want to say it's not easily understood, because I feel like that's a very pretentious thing to say, but it's not what a lot of people wanted from a Batman movie. Because I think ultimately you could call these characters anything else and the story still works. It just so happens that it's attached to an IP that people really enjoy. I think Batman Returns is a movie that's definitely worth a second look. And look, if you say I hate this as a Batman movie, I totally get it. I totally understand. This is not the Batman from the comics. This is not the Batman really from any 90 or 60s version. Like, there was no other version of Batman quite like this, and there really hasn't been one since. Uh, Honestly, I think because the Batman aspect of this Batman movie was the least important thing to Tim Burton, and I think that's what makes it the most interesting of all of his films and of all the Batman films, really. I know you guys are thinking, what about Dark Knight? Heath Ledger's Joker. It's like, Heath Ledger had an amazing performance as the Joker. No one's ever going to take that away. But for me, I feel like the Joker is this force of nature. And while that's, kind of fun to watch how that affects Batman, the Penguin is such a more well-rounded character. I can identify with Penguin. I've I've seen people who are, that version of that character. Just there's more to latch on to than just like a really cool performance with cool makeup and some quirky kind of lines. So there, well, I thought we were going to go this whole time without doing a hot take. There you go. I think Danny DeVito's Penguin is a more nuanced, interesting, layered Batman villain performance and character than Heath Ledger's Joker. There it is. I said it. It's on the record. That's kind of my deep dive into the psychology of Batman Returns. Thank you for kind of coming on this journey with me. A lot of it is, like I said, I had kind of bullet points, and a lot of it is just kind of stream of consciousness and really thinking about this movie. This is a movie that I think about a lot, and I will probably continue to think about, and I could probably come back in a couple months and do like a volume 2 about new ideas that I've had from this movie. And I think that's what makes this movie great. It's a movie that I can watch over and over again and get something new from it every time. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Like I said, we'll be back with a regular episode next week with Pacific Rim. Also coming up, we have Dan Merle and I talking The Lost World, Jurassic Park, Roth Cornett, talking about those Dunder Mifflin years without Michael Scott. That's all coming up. Hot Takes with Billy Biz. Thanks for listening.